Hello, hello. Thrilled to be here today to chat with each of you about Gatsby Camp. So I call this the What Have You Done For Me Lately edition. Ultimately, the goal of this is a refresher on what we've done lately in Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud, and a forward pointer to what we're doing and what we'll be doing in the future. So hi, if you haven't met me, my name is Dustin Schau. I'm VP of Product. So, like I said, let's do a quick recap. The last time we spoke was a little over 90 days ago at a pretty fun event called Gatsby Conf. And so Gatsby Conf was on March 2nd, 2021, and in just those 90 plus short days, we've done a lot of pretty great things, and I'd like to dive deep on a couple of them. So, in specific, at Gatsby Conf, we launched 6 key deliverables. We launched Gatsby Image, the next generation of the best-in-class image transformation approach that we use in Gatsby. We launched Gatsby Cloud Hosting, completing the first iteration of the complete cloud product with our best-in-class edge layer CDN powered by Fastly. We launched Gatsby version 3, which brought incremental builds to open source so that you can have, as much as possible, quick, speedy builds in your open source library, as well as in Gatsby Cloud. We launched improvements and updates to the Contentful source plugin, to the WordPress source plugin, and to the Shopify source plugin. That's just what we've launched on Gatsby Conf. We've done a lot since then. So, ultimately, I'm going to need a bigger boat. I'm going to need a bigger presentation to adequately fit this. And so we've launched a lot in just those short 90 days. So since Gatsby Conf, we've launched version 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and so on. Each kind of minor point release delivering iterative value to you, the user of Gatsby, where you use Gatsby most, the open source product. So some quick highlights of what we've done in each of these iterative releases. We've enabled 50 to 70% faster build speeds, 30 to 40% faster JavaScript bundling, and 20% faster query running. So you're probably sensing a theme here. We're always improving your local experience. Every other week, we have a minor version of Gatsby. Every other week, you upgrade, and you get this iterative value, these improvements to your local experience available in Gatsby open source. How do you get them? Well, I'm glad you asked. NPMI, Gatsby at latest, and oftentimes you'll be delighted by what you see. So we tweet these out every 2 weeks with our latest and greatest. Go check them out. And as much as possible, keep up to date, because we're always trying to improve the life of you, the local developer. In Gatsby Cloud, we had 3 kind of main features in the last 90 days. We had manual publishes, a way in which you can turn off automatic publishing and then manually publish content, or you can roll back to a previous version of your content. We launched a Deploy Now badge, where you can click seamlessly on a GitHub repository and deploy with just a quick set of automated steps on Gatsby Cloud. And we launched the headless commerce experience with Shopify. We launched a great best-in-class kind of Shopify starter, where you can get up and running and you can see how Gatsby and e-commerce can work together, powered by Shopify. All right, this is cool, you might be saying. But before we get too far on what's coming and what we're doing today, I want to take a step back. And so to do that, let's take a stroll down memory lane. Nostalgia is a really powerful thing. So this is the web of old. This was the static web. This was Yahoo, the front page of the internet before Reddit was the front page of the internet. This is static HTML rendered to an end user, and it'll stay up. It's pretty fault tolerant. It's fault tolerant HTML, and it's ultimately a fairly good user experience. However, and you can see, this is kind of the web of the 90s. This was the GeoCities. This was where creators could publish content super easily, and then you were able to share a link with your friend. The web of old was static, and so as I mentioned, the web of old is defined as fault-tolerant HTML, styling, and images. It's kind of like harkening back to an era when things were a little simpler with the static web. However, the rise of the decoupled and headless CMS has ushered in a new era for the modern web developer, and with it, it's corresponded a rise in the expectations of the end user experience. So rich web experiences are the norm, no longer the outlier. To keep up with your competition and to deliver an engaging experience that your users love, that your developers love, that your team loves, ultimately you have to craft a rich web experience which relies upon dynamic functionality. So when I think of the kind of skew and spectrum between dynamic and static, I think of it as a spectrum. Like oftentimes apps start static. Apps start today, in Gatsby as purely static generated HTML. And then along the way come requests. Along the way, you kind of sprinkle in dynamic functionality. You may want to fetch to get the latest and greatest comments. You may want to submit a contact form. And so it's always been possible in Gatsby. You kind of add and flesh in these little bits of dynamic functionality, therefore skewing your quote-unquote static application a touch more dynamic. And so basically, as websites evolve, as teams evolve in their sophistication, as user expectations evolve in what they expect of the modern web, you can kind of see that this trend towards like static alone isn't always enough. You ultimately will always have a need to kind of keep pulling towards more and more dynamic functionality. So again, the archetype of what I think of as really how user expectations have changed is an application like Gmail. Gmail is what users expect. While of course not all of us are building a Gmail-like experience, we are fleshing in dynamic functionality. We're fleshing in a way to, for instance, update a database, a way to query for something, basically a way in which a user can do something dynamic with a quote-unquote static application. And so again, there's a why for this. Like ultimately, if you deliver a more engaging experience, you can see an increase in overall user engagement. So West Elm, when they migrated to a progressive web app architecture, they saw a 15% increase in average time spent on site and a 9% lift in revenue per visit. Ultimately, the kind of better experience you deliver for your user is directly tied to your bottom line revenues and ultimately in your user happiness, user satisfaction, and user retention. And so when I think of like where Gatsby is positioned and what Gatsby is doing, really it's building upon each of the kind of shoulders of these bygone eras. So it's really kind of a love letter to how each of these can be stitched together to create an application and a site that your users love. So Gatsby kind of plucks kind of the good parts of the previous era of static sites, fault-tolerant HTML. Gatsby is, at the end of the day, just producing static HTML. It's enabling you to source content performantly from a CMS. It's enabling you to stitch these together, this data layer, in a rich web experience. And ultimately, it's enabling for developers to create engaging web experiences that marketers love, that your teams love, kind of building upon the shoulders of each of these giants in this bygone era. And so again, when we think of how websites are created, it's kind of simple. Websites are built by teams of developers, marketers, and designers working together collaboratively. Whether it was 1990 or 2020 or 2021, every era of web development really has the same commonality: teams producing websites. In that earlier example, when I was thinking of, kind of sprinkling in dynamic functionality, this is how this goes. A marketer may shoulder tap a developer and say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if? And there you have a new addition to scope, you have a new kind of area where your website needs to grow, and ultimately the interplay between each of these is what we're trying to solve for and what we're trying to improve every day, every week, every month, because again, web teams build websites. And again, when you think of each of these pieces, the developers, this may be you. This may be why you're here. You want to kind of learn some techniques on how you can use Gatsby and how you can leverage Gatsby to solve your use cases. And so this is an important stakeholder, but not the only stakeholder of the modern website. And so when I think of the developer, I ultimately think the life of the front-end developer has ultimately never been better. You have so much power at your fingertips. You can pull in a library from React, you can pull in many libraries from NPM, and ultimately you can get something really sophisticated really quickly without always needing to be a deep expert. However, it's not exactly easy. There's this great article from Chris Croyer from CSS Tricks where it's really talking about the widening responsibility for front-end developers. And ultimately, I think you can see web has evolved, and so too has the kind of widening responsibilities of front-end developers. So no longer is it quote-unquote just the UI. Now front-end developers are tasked with adding in dynamic functionality, maybe setting up serverless functions, with Node.js, and so what that ultimately means is that you as a front-end developer have an increasingly wide swath of responsibility, and that has a big mental burden. And so again, marketers. Again, we're trying to solve for both of these camps. So as you've probably seen, if you're a team building a site or a team building with a Gatsby site, marketers and developers can regularly be at odds. Add that one more tracking script, or again, wouldn't it be cool if we could do that X thing? And so oftentimes that interplay, that collaboration can be a bit combative. And so ultimately, our vision for Gatsby is how we bring these two personas together, is to help build a website that both camps not only love the result, of course, which the users love, but that they love creating. and that they're able to get to a really sophisticated outcome, a really great website, as quickly as possible. That's why we exist, and those are the kind of problems that we're trying to solve for. Teams using Gatsby, teams creating websites, and the interplay between the marketer, the developer, the designer, and the team. So again, our goal, bringing developers and marketers together. And so one of the kind of key aspects of this Gatsby Camp conference is a focus on e-commerce and how Gatsby can help you solve and how Gatsby can help you build an amazing website regardless of what space you're in. So I'd like to talk a little bit about e-commerce story. And so again, it's teams of marketers, developers, and designers who are building applications, of which e-commerce may be one such types of applications that you're building. So first, again, some data and some quotes. So this is from Shopify. So 2 years ago, only 13.6% of sales were made from online purchases. Today, that number is expected to reach 19.5% by the end of the year. So that's a 46%-ish growth metric from just this year. And I think that trend is going to continue. You know, the rise of e-commerce, the rise of headless, the rise of decoupled is a trend that I think is here to stay. And so e-commerce is exploding. You know, this trend does not show any signs of ceasing. You know, you might be saying, this is great. You know, I love e-commerce, and now I can use e-commerce with Gatsby. That's amazing. Not always. You know, so of 174,000 e-commerce sites, according to HTTP archive data from Google, only 72 score 100 in performance. So a very, very, very small net of sites that are actually delivering upon, you know, the promise of performant e-commerce. The average score, you know, so again, of those 174,000 sites that are classified as e-commerce sites with HTTP archive, the average median Lighthouse score is just 30. So that means that there is a huge opportunity to improve, you know, these scores and to improve the overall performance numbers, bumping those performance numbers up by decoupling and using something like Gatsby with Shopify. And so I think this graphic really kind of puts this starkly on display. So the red is basically anything less than 25%. The yellow is anything less than 50%, and the green, and I'm being a little charitable here, the green is anything above 75%. And so what you can see is this distribution. You know, most sites in the e-commerce space score pretty poorly. You know, they score below a 25 as measured by Lighthouse. 34% score below a 50, and only 13% score above a 75. So when you put this data on display, a key kind of takeaway here is that 77% of e-commerce sites score as a 0.4 or less in Lighthouse. And so, you know, you may see this as a problem. To me, I see this as an opportunity. You know, this is a way in which you can outclass your competitors. You can deliver an engaging e-commerce experience with Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud that, you know, scores highly, that helps you get to 100 in Lighthouse. And that, again, ultimately helps impact your bottom lines, you know, lower bounce rate, higher retention. Ultimately, more products purchased more frequently, with your site that is a joy and a delight to use, powered by Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud. And so again, it's not a problem, this is an opportunity. You have an opportunity using the stack, of which I hope you'll kind of learn how you can confidently choose Gatsby for e-commerce use cases and dynamic use cases. But you have an opportunity to be faster. You also have an opportunity to iterate more quickly, to collaborate more quickly, so that ultimately you can confidently choose Gatsby for your next project, your current project, and you can execute your competitors with this stack. So that's great, but what are we doing today? Few things. So first of all, as Kyle indicated, we're thrilled to announce Gatsby Functions. For us, Gatsby Functions, you know, puts control back to the developer. It enables, you know, the quote-unquote average front-end developer to get really sophisticated, harkening back to that widening area of responsibility. This is a way that a front-end developer can feel like a superhero. And today, with Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud, we're thrilled to announce and we're thrilled to begin to discuss how you can leverage Gatsby Functions for your next dynamic functionality with Gatsby. Next, we're going to do a deep dive on Gatsby e-commerce, basically the kinds of things that you can build with Gatsby in the e-commerce space, powered by our excellent first-class Shopify source plugin. And then finally, next-gen preview, a glimpse at what we're doing today and what we'll be doing, you know, now and always, in helping bring marketers and developers closer together, helping teams collaborate, helping teams kind of confidently choose Gatsby and, you know, confidently choose a decoupled or headless architecture. So when I really think of this, I harken back to the spectrum from the earlier slide. where Gatsby was before today, we were a little more on the purist side. We were a little more on the kind of like static all the things. Basically, Gatsby was maybe a little purist in its static mindset. Where we're moving towards, is a touch more dynamic, a sprinkle of dynamic functionality with Gatsby functions. And, I just want to say, we're not done yet. Ultimately, Gatsby evolves with the needs of the modern web. Gatsby evolves with the needs of the professional developer. Gatsby evolves with the needs of teams, making and we're really kind of like celebrating how the web should be built. And so as the web evolves, so too does Gatsby. So again, this is our first kind of foray into making Gatsby more dynamic. Let me assure you, we are not done. This is not the final destination. This is just the start of the journey. So, as always, those who know me know I like to show and not merely tell. So I'd like to take just 1 or 2 minutes and do a quick little demo of the high-level deliverables, Gatsby functions, e-commerce, and then next-gen preview UI, so that you can kind of get a glimpse of what this looks like. And then you can stick around for the later talks throughout the day to kind of get a deeper dive on what it looks like to truly feel and to use and to confidently choose Gatsby for your next site. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to leverage the power of Gatsby functions available on Gatsby Cloud to augment my e-commerce experience so that I can sprinkle in some dynamic functionality to deliver a more rich, engaging experience. So what I'm going to do, phrased more simply, is I'm going to add a form field, basically so that users can come to my site, subscribe to my newsletter, and I can give them updates on the latest and greatest products that are available for their purchase. So first, what I'll do is I will add the SendGrid dependency. So I'm using SendGrid here. Of course, you can use whatever kind of tool you want. Basically, the power and flexibility of Gatsby functions is that if there's an NPM package available for it, you can certainly use it, or of course, you could write it yourself. So next, I will start adding my API. So I'll spin up my local Gatsby development server so that I can kind of confidently preview my changes, get a sense of what they look like before I then publish to my end users with Gatsby Cloud. So it's up and running. Really quickly, what we'll see here is you can kind of click through. This is using the Gatsby Starter Shopify. This is basically a way in which you can kind of get a leg up, get a quick little start on building out your e-commerce experience, again, so that you can confidently choose Gatsby to deliver a fast, engaging experience for your end users. But what we'll do now is we'll start writing this API. So we'll create a source API folder. Next, we'll create the API itself. So of course, as Kyle mentioned previously, this is a file system driven API. So the name of the file is the name of the API. So I'll call this subscribe. The nice thing here is this uses kind of familiar Express syntax. So it's just a plain old node function. So we'll export default function subscribe with the request and response objects. So just to see this working really quickly, we'll pass some JSON. We'll set the status to 200, and then we'll say hello from Gatsby functions. You can see this will hot reload in my local development server. Next, I'll pull up this API. So you can see here, it really matches the convention that you'd think. So when we harken back to this, it was source API subscribe. The API is accessible to you at that same path. So hello from Gatsby functions. Now let's actually implement our Twilio SendGrid function. So that previous dependency I installed, let's say sgmail is require SendGrid mail. Every single step of the way, I can hot reload, and when I save the file, Gatsby will helpfully refresh my local development server. So I'm actually going to make this an async function because this is going to be asynchronous functionality. So first, I'll set my API key. So sgmail.set API key. And then this is available by whatever you prefer. Locally, I have a .env file. So that's going to source local environment variables. In Gatsby Cloud, you can have whatever environment variables you'd like. We'll refresh this just to make sure it's still wired up appropriately, and it looks like it's still working, which is always great. So then we'll send a message. Here I'm just going to copy some messaging from Twilio's API documentation. We'll say Dustin@gatsbyjs.com. You know how my email, Dustin@gatsbyjs.com. and then we will send this message. So we'll await this. The parameter here for the SendGrid API is sgmail.send, and then it takes this JSON response. So we'll refresh this. All right, looks like it may have worked. Now let's check. We can see here, as I pull up my email, the sending with SendGrid is fun and easy to do anywhere, even with Node.js. Of course, we want to customize this to our end users, so we'll do that very quickly. So the subject, thank you for subscribing. The text will say, thanks for subscribing. We will send you updates from time to time. Of course, this is an artificially contrived example. You'd want to add unsubscribe functionality and that kind of thing. So what we'll do instead now is we'll just say succeeded in sending email, and then we'll add a success is true, because why not? Send this again, and we can see it works just like we'd expect. So this is all fine and dandy. Now what I want to do is I want to push this up to Gatsby Cloud. All right, so now what I'll show is I'll show logging in with Gatsby Cloud so that we can see what has happened behind the scenes. We'll log in. I'll log in with Google, which we recently added this functionality so that you and your content editors can log in with the tool of choice. I'll go to my personal workspace. I will then look up Shopify Starter. And then we can see that our subscription API has actually been, is currently building. And so as you might expect, this will actually fail when I would try to invoke this in production because I haven't added the appropriate environment variables. So we'll do that just now. So here I'm going to add the environment variables to Gatsby Cloud. So I'll pull up my .env file. I will use this to then paste. We have a feature called bulk add, where I can bulk add the environment variable, and I can add them all at once rather than one by one. And you can see I can now save this. All right, we'll go back to the build. That will actually trigger another build because the environment variables were updated. But we can see what's happening behind the scenes. And now we can see the one that we'd expect to work. So we have our functions. No logs for this function yet. So let's hit it so that we can actually see what happens. We'll go to API, subscribe, and it succeeded in sending the email. We'll go back to our functions and we can see the invocation. It finished in just under 1 second. So this has been a quick little demo of what you can do with the power of Gatsby Functions, Gatsby Cloud, and an API like SendGrid's email API. I hope you enjoyed that brief demo. What I hope to have showed today is how Gatsby is shifting left in the static versus dynamic spectrum. Gatsby is evolving with the needs of the modern web, where you oftentimes want to sprinkle in bits of dynamic functionality to meet and exceed the demands of your user and to enable you, the developer, to feel like a superhero in delivering the rich web experiences that users have come to expect. So what we're showing today is how with Gatsby and e-commerce and functions with Gatsby Cloud and next-gen preview UI, we are helping bring developers and marketers together, and we're helping you, the front-end developer, feel like a superhero, feel like a wizard, feel like you can confidently tackle any choice and confidently choose and recommend Gatsby for your current project and every project thereafter. Thanks for sticking by for Gatsby Camp, and stay tuned for some of the excellent talks we have in store for you.